Okay, so then I would suggest that we start with the presentations. Nicole said all about discussion. You have all the options of posting your questions during the presentations in the Q&A section. Later in the discussion time, you can also raise your hand. I'll have an eye on this in order to manage a proper discussion. And for now, I would hand over the floor to Zynja and Laura, please.
Thank you very much. Also, thank you very much for inviting us to this seminar, and thank you, Martin, for this nice introduction. I am sure that you would agree with me that there is not the one solution how to cope with hate speech as a society, but that different or various strategies are needed in this case. This includes different content moderation strategies and regulation, but also counter-speech activities by civil society actors, or quite fundamental, in my opinion, a systematic monitoring of hate speech.
Zynja, just
yes?
a comment. We can see your notes on the screen. I don't know if you choose the wrong part of your presentation. Yeah, that's it.
That's actually my problem. Apologies.
Okay, sorry for that. Do you now have a better view? Shall I continue? Okay.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Sorry.
Go on.
Okay, so I was saying that for any of these strategies, it is helpful, if not even necessary, to identify hate speech comments automatically or semi-automatically. And in our talk, Laura and myself will shed some light on the question why that is not such an easy task. And we will share some insights from the No Hate project with you. For this purpose, we will give you a very short background information on the No Hate project. And we will then highlight some fundamental challenges of defining hate speech on the internet and of detecting it automatically. And we will then address or explain to you how we try to address some of these challenges in our project, and then discuss or come to a conclusion. As Martin already mentioned in the introduction, the No Hate project was an interdisciplinary project, and it brought together 3 partners. At the one hand, there were communication scholars involved from the Freie Universität Berlin, and we worked together with computer scientists from Beuth Hochschule, also in Berlin, and a business partner, which was Vico Analytics, a company specialized on social media monitoring. And the main aim of our project was to develop an algorithm for hate speech detection in user comments on the topic of immigration to Germany. So it was a topical case study. And then to integrate that algorithm in a content moderation tool used in newsrooms. So the aim of the project was quite a practical one, which was to help or to support online journalists and content moderators monitoring the user discussions on their internet sites. We also heard in the introduction that there is a trend towards automatic hate speech detection. To emphasize against this background that even humans struggle to identify what hate speech actually is, and also to identify it consistently. And I think that this is due to several reasons. A first reason is an inflation of terms in the literature, but also in the public discourse. There are many closely related terms to hate speech, such as, for example, hateful speech, dangerous speech, incivility, or toxicity, just to name a few. And those terms are quite often used interchangeably, even though they're not quite the same, or not always the same. Of course, they overlap, but as I said, they're not exactly the same. And I think that there's a certain danger in that the hate speech concept gets blurred and stretched and becomes more of a general label for various forms of negative expressions. And the second important point, I think, is that hate speech is not hate plus speech. In other words, hate speech is not limited to emotional forms of speech, since the motivations behind it are so manifold. Hate speech can, for example, be motivated by a maintenance of power relations, or by ideology, or simply by boredom or attention seeking. And these forms can use quite rational language or argumentative language patterns, so to say. And so that was one part of the argument. And the other part is that hate speech is not limited to speech acts, especially on the internet. It's much more about communication and interaction and multimodal content. A third challenge is the difficulty of line drawing. I would bet that we all would agree on extreme examples of hate speech, but decide differently about less extreme and implicit examples. And those implicit examples are quite difficult to grasp consistently by different people, because they are so sensitive to context and also to interpretation. However, they make up for the biggest part of work in content moderation. So they need to be checkable in order for any content moderation to work effectively. And then a fourth challenge is that hate speakers use coded language that is created or adapted Bayesian words that are used out of context to then, for example, an example are codes such as Google and Yahoo, which are used in the US-American context to refer to specific communities, in this case, the Black and the Mexican community. So that means that you need expert knowledge, so to say, to understand such forms of hate speech.
And so defining hate speech already is not easy for humans, like Sunil said, and that also makes it more difficult for machines to replicate, because they have no additional or no knowledge on their own that leaves them with these challenges all by themselves, basically. And these challenges are, first of all, a bias in the training data itself, which means that depending on what sources we use or within which topics we source our data, we will have an overrepresentation of specific topics. For the No Hate project, for example, because we wanted to look at migration and refuge as a topic, we will also teach the model to focus on words regarding this specific topic. And language itself is also different on each platform, for example, in length or in style or in interaction. And that's something that's more challenging for a machine than it would have been for a human being. Finally, when we cooperate or when we use data from news agencies, their reason to delete or to hide a comment is not just because it is hateful. It might also be because it's just out of scope for that specific conversation, or it contains inappropriate links or whatever. And training based on these data, if it's not well reflected, will also not just identify hate speech. So that's the bias in the training data. And then complexity of language is another issue, especially for automation. Our colleagues showed some linguistic limits. That basically means that it's hard for machines to identify toxicity that does not contain swear words, or to deal with rhetorical questions with metaphors and comparisons, sarcasm and irony, and also rare words, which means words that don't occur very often, because it is like the metaphors and stuff is not necessarily manifest content, and the machine does not have any context besides what can be measured within the manifest words themselves. Another point for machines definitely is that what we apply here are statistical methods, or the machines apply statistical methods, and their aim is to reduce and to abstract knowledge from data. And if there's not enough data in the beginning, such as rare words, it will be hard to make them visible or to incorporate them into this kind of abstraction. Finally, their language varies within communities, even if they are basically using the same language. Research has shown that, for example, comments written in African American English are up to 2 times more likely to be labeled as offensive compared to other comments. Because machines, again, cannot detect who is speaking and with which motivation, but it does matter in speech, especially in hate speech. And then there's the annotation bias. Like Sonia said, humans have a hard time detecting hate speech. So reliability in the basic data set from which machines learn is already a problem. And crowdsourcing doesn't really solve that problem, meaning more coders to balance out a bias to find a consensus does not necessarily help, because their experience and their context knowledge is unknown, but it does influence how they code nonetheless.
As I said in the introduction, we addressed some of these identified challenges in our project by developing a flexible framework to identify different forms of hate speech indirectly in text, and by combining methods of standardized content analysis that we use in communication studies quite routinely. With the method of text annotation. And I will briefly explain to you a bit more what we did. First of all, we worked with a theory-driven definition of hate speech that was closely related to its original understanding. That means we defined hate speech as communication of discrimination and violence targeting specific groups or their members. And we differed between 3 different forms of hate speech, which you can find on the slide: negative stereotyping, dehumanization, and violence and killing. And these 3 categories were further defined in a coding manual with detailed coding instructions, which also contained a lot of real examples of, for example, implicit and ambiguous forms of hate speech that we sampled in qualitative pre-studies. If you, on the slide, you can see the first page of our manual. I don't know how good your eyesight is and how big you can see the screen. You might spot maybe that the manual code contained about 23 pages, something like this. So there was quite a bit of reading involved. For the students, we then trained in several training sessions on the task to reliably identify those hate speech forms in user comments. On the next slide, you can see that we also trained these coders to identify which group was targeted in a hate speech comment. So we did not only identify the 3 hate speech forms I mentioned before, but also what the target of a hate speech comment was, and also on the basis of which dimension this target group was aggressed. For example, we differed between physical appearance or behavior, character, such things. And in the bottom part of the table, you can see that we also labeled different forms of offensive language in the comments, but independently from the hate speech elements. So our hate speech understanding was not related to certain use of words. So we labeled for insults and slurs, for example, but that was independently from our hate speech definition. So far for the theory, I will briefly explain in more practical terms what we did. To label hate speech in the user comments, we work with a browser-based software for structured text annotation, which is called BREAD. And you can see 2 screenshots from our work with BREAD on the slide. And the task of hate speech detection using BREAD was basically following 3 steps. Otis first read a news article on the topic of immigration to Germany, and then up to 50 user comments in their original order. And in the comments, they then identified judgments of groups or individuals in these comments. But they had to account the whole context to identify this judgment. So they did not look at each comment individual, but always the whole thread and the article the comments referred to. And they then highlighted the judgment in the comment and further qualified the judgment by using predefined labels from our coding manual. And this is what I mean when I was saying earlier that we identified hate speech indirectly. So the coders were not tasked to say this is hate speech or not, but they had to identify the judgment and then say, okay, is it a judgment that is using dehumanization? And the comments that contained at least one of the 3 hate speech elements I showed you before were then later classified as a hate speech comment in our training data set.
There we go. The next step would then be to translate what we have coded there into the machine learning part, right? And it would be so nice if we could use the same rules or dictionaries as were presented in the code book to humans, also to machines. So it would be nice if we could use rules and dictionaries to define words or word combinations that are hate speech. And that is actually something that a lot of newsrooms or community moderators already use. They have blacklists for specific words, for example. But these are quite rigid and they barely know any word context. Sometimes they can't even handle a negation of a word. So identifying abstract concepts such as dehumanization or generalization is quite impossible with rules or dictionaries. What we want is something that's closer to a human approach, and this is where now finally artificial intelligence comes in. Artificial intelligence basically wants to or should imitate what humans do, in our case, what the human coders do. And in artificial intelligence, we have the subdiscipline of machine learning that uses statistical methods to identify patterns in data. And we focused on supervised learning, which is more specifically used for classification. And it means that we do not define rules. We just give the machine the outcome, and we let the machine then figure out how to get to the outcome from the data. To give you a bit more insight into this, how this usually works, the supervised learning is we have user comments that had been labeled by human coders as either hate speech or not, containing hate speech or not containing hate speech. And then we use an algorithm that learns to infer what features of the text result in a specific label. And we test this model by letting the model predict labels and comparing them to human-made labels. So we check whether it mostly agrees with what the humans had coded before. And if we're satisfied with the results, we can actually give the model new data, new comments that had not been used before. And it will then, on the new data, also predict whether this probably contains hate speech or not. However, this is not exactly working as it worked with the human coders. And you already know that we need a lot of data here because we're using statistical methods. And that's usually more than expert coders can reasonably handle. So the challenges that are inherent to this approach, lack of context, needing a lot of data, we try to solve them a little bit differently. And what we did, now there's another nice graphic. In the no-hate approach specifically, we try to solve this lack of context knowledge and rare words by using an existing language model first. So the image you can see on the bottom with the pink circles is basically a language model. In our case, the German BERT model, which was basically developed by Google. And it's trained on a vast amount of language data already, and it kind of knows relations between words that might not yet exist in our user comments, but could show up in new unknown comments. And that already gives us a lot of how words relate to each other, a lot of that knowledge. So it's a lot more context and more data, of course. And then you can see on top here, we then train the model for our specific task, meaning identifying hate speech. And for that, we use the manually coded user comments from the no-hate project, as Sunja just explained. What you notice here is that the no-hate model, so the automated approach, does not differentiate hate speech as finely as we did in the manual analysis. It does not identify negative stereotypes, dehumanization, or references to violence and killing. Instead, it infers directly from the text, from the comment, to the hate or no hate label, and it kind of skips this step in between that we used in the human part. However, this in-between step is quite useful because having coded these elements of hate speech manually now allows us to identify what kind of comments are easy to classify as hate speech for a machine and which one are more challenging. And that is what we did. And I'm giving you 2 examples of how that worked out. So with regard to the targets of a comment, what we learned is that the model tends to create false positive, meaning it says this is hate speech, but the humans had not labeled it as hate speech when the targets are refugees or immigrants. And this is most probably because of the bias in the data set that we have, because we use data that is specific, like concerns specifically immigration and refuge as a topic. The model learned to focus on those words. And then, yeah, second example now is the in-between step. We learned that negative stereotypes are a lot harder to identify than dehumanization or references to physical violence and killing. And this is most probably because the negative stereotypes are less manifest, they're more latent, they're not as hard-coded into the words themselves than the other forms or elements of hate speech. So despite using BERT for data and context, the manifest content is still a lot easier to detect for machines. And this leads us to some key learnings and to our outlook now. Simply using more data very apparently does not solve how statistics and technology frame the possible solutions to a problem in like the general sense. However, using an interdisciplinary approach in this area is necessary if we want to identify more context factors to the subject. For example, we've seen that the social science approach that Sunja presented in the beginning helps us to then later better identify issues in the technological solutions. And then there's a lot more future work that we can do.
Yeah, and I would just finish with highlighting 2 of these still open questions that we think are important. First one is that, as Laura just explained, we saw in our no hate project that in how far the logic of a content-specific case study, so in this case, a study of hate speech in the particular context of immigration and refuge, how this logic can collide with the aim to train a general hate speech model. So we were also struggling with this bias based on data choices. And another very important area to our opinion is the question of explainability of machine classifications or models. Okay, so much from our side. We would like to say thank you for your attention and for your comments and questions. And if you have more questions than we can discuss today, you can also find more on our project on our website, which is very easy, nohate.online.
Thank you. So I just took over. Nicole, so I think we agreed upon moving the discussion to the end and just have the inputs first. Am I right? Yeah. Great. So then, yeah, thank you, Laura and Sunje, for this input. We already have some questions in the chat and the Q&A section. So we keep that to the discussion part at the end. And I would just hand over the floor now to Matti and his presentation.
All right, thanks, Martin. Let me just get my share screen, if I can find it. Oops, that doesn't seem to be doing well. Desktop, wait, what's going on here? 1 second. Why is it not showing my browser? Let's see what's going on. I think it's because I have it on a different, wait. That is strange. Why is it not opening it? 1 second, let me see if I can find it here. So this is sometimes always the sorry, it's doing my little annoying moment.
If you're stuck and want to send it to me, I can also.
Okay, because basically I have it open on Google Drive, but when I'm doing this, I can't get my Google Drive to open. So, well, it's there, but then, so if we can do it this way, 1 second, just let me do a bit of work around this. So yeah, sorry, doing it live. Yep, and then we do it this way. Now I should do it. All right, let's try one more time, and then otherwise I'll send it. That has it here. So Nicole, what I'll do is I'll send you my, just to avoid wasting time, I'll send you the slide link right now. And then if you can open it there, we can do a joint. Because
no problem. We can also take a question or two if you want to try and, if you're still working on it.
So if you have a couple of questions, so probably having a different window, it hasn't happened before. So I'm just trying to figure out why is it going this way? So just give me 1 second. I'll figure it out.
Yes. Sure. So we could just try to answer 1 or 2 questions that were already asked in the chat and the Q&A section. I don't know if Sunje and Laura may have an answer to this one question from the Q&A section, and that is the question whether no hate has been evaluated compared to algorithms Facebook and other platforms are using. So how good is this algorithm in the field of hate speech detection?
Yes, thank you, Bethany, for the question. We cannot really answer this because the Facebook algorithm is proprietary. We cannot look into it. What we would have to do is give our data to Facebook, have them test their algorithm, let them tell us whether it's performing better or worse, and trust them on that. I would say what makes our approach better is that it is not proprietary, right? It was developed at a university. It could be open to the public, and that makes it a lot easier to audit. And that's definitely one advantage. Do you want to add on that, Sinja?
Yeah, I was just maybe a different answer would be, I mean, what we did, of course, was to check in publications of other research teams that did similar things and compare their precision and recall values with those of our model. And I would guess that we were a bit in the middle. So we did not beat them all, but our model was also not the worst one. However, what we did, and we did not mention this in our presentation due to time constraints, but we did actually 2 different error analysis of the model. The first one was because our coders, we coded 3 different subsamples, and the first subsamples were used to train the model, and we did then a first error analysis, and those error analysis was quite satisfactory. And then a year later, we coded a 3rd subsample, and then did a second error analysis with these data, and the performance drop. And we think that this was quite an interesting example of how context matters, because we used the exactly same string words to sample our news articles and comments, and everything was the same. However, the public agenda moved on to new topics and issues related to immigration in Germany. So the discussion evolved, language changed a bit, maybe, I don't know. But so yeah, that was quite interesting for us, and I hope also for you.
Okay, thank you. There are some more questions, but I think as Matti is ready now, as I...
Fingers crossed that it works this time, but it should be
Okay.
working. So just bear with me 1 second. So that should do it. Are we seeing the screen? We are seeing the screen. Great. So let me go on present mode. So yeah, sorry for again the minor technical glitch. Sometimes happens. I actually realized that I got a new computer, so I hadn't set up the permissions to be sharing my screen. So hopefully that didn't cause too much of a disruption to going things. So what I will do, and I was initially going with a 10 to 12 minute presentation, so I'm going to spend a bit more time perhaps on the discussion parts. So I will take a slightly more global overview into the idea of AI hate speech and online content moderation. And I won't go as much into the specifics of how these things, the mechanics of online hate speech detection works, but I'd rather look at some of the more broader issues, what I've been encountering in my work on online hate speech, and focus specifically around some of the work that we are starting or ongoing in the Ethiopian context. And I will try to bring in slightly more questions relating to the global South and Africa in particular. But I think I might have my perspective to this is slightly idiosyncratic. And so I will explain first how I came to think about this issue this way, and how that kind of frames the questions that I'm asking, and how that frames the research that I'm working. So kind of roundabout way, coming back to the earlier introduction that got cut off, I will do a very brief reintroduction of how I came to be interested in this topic, and what my kind of intellectual trajectory was for getting there. So in a way, so I started looking at this debate around starting specifically looking at online social media hate speech. And we worked on this project for Oxford Program for Comparative Media Law and Policy. And we're looking at online hate speech debates in Ethiopia, and using a very kind of content analysis model where we had a coding book, and I think ours was about 40 pages long. and manual coders trying to identify and what are the key terms and how do we look at the country that hasn't really been addressed in the literature and the research. And this was ongoing from around 2014 to 2016. So kind of following that, we started working on this project called Extreme Speech. And so the idea was to start coming up with a slightly more contextual anthropological perspective to the debates on extreme speech. And we're trying to frame a way of understanding this problem that would look at it more, looking at examples from the global South. And so we saw that the debate was very much dominated by the European and the US context. So my colleague Sahana, we was working in Indian context, and I was bringing more kind of Ethiopian context, the research, and we had this kind of digital anthropological agenda of trying to understand the issue. But I've also been working on very much on the kind of extremism debates going both in the European context, violent online political extremism, and some of the kind of methodological debates around that. So I worked for the Voxpol network, which looks at violent online political extremism. So these kind of multiple different perspectives have been in the background framing the issue, and how I've increasingly come to look at especially the role of technology and the role of artificial intelligence and how it plays in the debates around the problem with extreme speech and increasingly the problem of content moderation. So I'll try to go explain that in step by step, how I go from there into the specifics, and then finally to the research that I'm doing at the moment. And I really enjoyed the first presentation for the very technical kind of parts of it. And I also do a lot of kind of very practical work around this. So I have done a fair bit of data analysis. I have a kind of an understanding of what goes on behind the black box. We work with some more kind of creative practical applications of using computer vision and trying to using unbiased models. And I've been writing around this in multiple instances. So I think as many of the people who work with this, the term AI itself doesn't really mean anything. That rather it's more interesting what specifically goes inside the box. So I will try to very briefly also talk about what do we mean by this so-called AI when we talk about the kind of the role AI plays in content moderation. So this global technology and this extreme speech perspective are the way I'll try to frame some of the issues, and as a way of how could we provide potentially some global questions relating to now what is called the the debate around content moderation. So let me just jump right into it. So what I'll do is basically three things, and I'll call the first, and sorry for some of the technical language that I've been using. So the first I will call what I call algorithmic mediations of a media in crisis, or what I also call the emerging problem solution assemblage. And I will discuss briefly what I mean by this. And the second is I'll briefly talk in specific that what exactly is meant by AI in content moderation, and raise some of the specific challenges for Global South and for Africa in particular. And then I will kind of end up with some concluding thoughts of where my research is going at the moment. So as somebody who's been researching digital cultures probably for the last 20 years now, and this is something a lot of you probably can relate to, there has been a dramatic shift from the more utopian discourse of technology, digital media, to a more dystopian discourse. And so we see that there is a lot of kind of emphasis on the more negative sides of things. So what is interesting on this, and in a way I've started through my work increasingly look at this, that we cannot look at the problem only. So we have to look at the problem and the prescribed solutions together. So in a way, this is that what I see this debate is going increasingly around this, what is called an involved in the problems and attempts to solve it. So what we have been seeing, and this comes to a long kind of trajectory of debates of digital cultures, we have been seeing, and these are all just newspaper articles that I've been collecting, that since about 2015, we have been going from, first we had the utopian discourse and shifting increasingly into the debate on New World Disorder and the idea that social media is destroying democracy. Now with COVID-19, we have misinformation, we have hate speech, extremism. There are different steps along the way that have been, so this debate has been very rapidly emerging, but in this kind of problem solution assemblage, we're also seeing a solution emerge as part of this problem. So I call this the debate on media in crisis, and we see this playing out increasingly vocally and in the last even 2 years. And so the solution to this media crisis increasingly is being said to be technology. So we are dealing with, in a way, this real or imagined risk of this media in crisis caused by what we call extreme speech. And to solve this problem or mitigate it, we need some kind of content moderation. And so the logic goes. And the proposed solution to this is often described as more technology and AI. And again, whether it's a good or bad solution, I'm not really making a judgment here, but there also, sometimes it happens at the expense of other solutions, which in a way leads to other kind of new questions that I'm interested in. So for me to understand the role of technology in content moderation, I cannot look at it outside this more discursive emergence of this new, what I call problem solution assemblage. So this in a way colors, or this kind of influences the work that I'm doing. I'll discuss briefly towards the end of the presentation how I'm looking at this, especially in the debates linking the global south. And so again, there's a quote from the recent Facebook community standards that they are using a lot of technology so automatic detection systems can detect 97% of hate speech, which I think is slightly exaggerated. And if we go to certain countries in the global south, we know that this doesn't really exist at such levels. But again, a lot of kind of things that are brought into this mix here. So when we talk about AI, and we are in fact, and if you talk about content moderation, we are in fact talking about a subset of content moderation. And this is a schematic overview of Facebook, which now has become the case study that most people discuss, but all companies have their own different attempts of content moderation. And so oftentimes when we deal with technology or AI, we are dealing with one specific section of what takes place in content moderation. So a lot of the work is still being done by manual coders, but there is the increased push that also emerged with COVID-19 to move towards what is called automated content moderation. And so basically being able to moderate content or send it to manual coders, flag it, so then it kind of scales the process given how much of such content is being produced. And so it is in a way some automatic systems to flag, identify, match, predict, or classify some piece of content on the basis of what you showed really well in the first presentation, that there are all kinds of algorithms and mechanisms and challenges with that. And so in a way, there are two specific, and this is very common, because if one of the kind of earlier cases of this kind of at-scale content moderation took place with jihadist movements, so we can see the emergence of that. So there are a number of, or two different types of techniques that are commonly used in content moderation. And so the first one is called hash matching, which is quite effective in the way you do it. So you basically create a database of images, which you then match other images to, and then they'll be automatically removed. So it happens a lot in child pornography, happens a lot of, so that's the way, for instance, Twitter and other companies were able to get ISIS content very quickly offline. So there was a database of content that was then hash matched. And obviously, one thing to add here is that we also dealing a lot with images now. So it's the textual component of hate speech has become increasingly balanced out by a lot more image and kind of visual material as well. And the second one is prediction, which is in a way very well explained what you were doing in the first presentation. So you use labeled data to predict and then classify some new data based on pre-existing kind of knowledge about that. And so you see there's a lot of different technologies already at play in working. And this is from Gorba, who has provided a good overview of hash matching, predictions, deep learning, and what kind of technologies are being used. So what in a way are then the challenges with this? And this is somewhere that I'm getting very interested also in looking at. So trying to raise some questions of, especially when we move of looking at artificial intelligence in the global south and context, where that kind of work hasn't been sufficiently or hasn't been developed. And oftentimes it's a question of resources. And if you work with non-European languages, you'll very quickly know that some of these mechanisms mentioned in the first presentation, BERT or the language models, simply don't exist in, let's say, one of the 60 languages in Ethiopia that is being used. So there is no computational models, there is no pre-existing, you'll have to build everything from scratch. So these things are improved, but still it takes a lot of resources to pre-build such computational models to be accurate. For instance, the Somali language, as far as I know, still doesn't have an agreed grammar. So there are only a handful of people working on these things. And I remember talking to the Ministry of Communication, or Ministry of Innovation, Ethiopia, Technology and Innovation, Ethiopia, and he said that Facebook didn't have the business prerogative to, again, this is just one random comment that I was in. So anyways, what was being said that the Facebook didn't have the business prerogative to take Ethiopia at such. Yeah, they didn't want to. It was very hard to get them to get involved because it was a minor market for them. So, anyways, the technological questions in AI moderation come from the lack of resources, and so we are dealing with the lack of contextual knowledge. We are dealing lack of low resource language models, and also the embedded West-centric biases in the existing models, and the absent quality data sets. And contextual knowledge being that oftentimes, as the first presentation well said, you need that kind of contextual background when you go into it. And so there's also often a focus on certain platforms and the challenge of encryption. So a lot of the debate takes place on encrypted forums where it's very hard to use big data models or AI models on them. And then there's also what is commonly known as the lack of transparency and explainability in the kind of algorithms that are used. And so this is especially with the big companies that we know kind of what the algorithms are, but how specifically they are implemented, it's very hard to get information because these are trade secrets. But more kind of fundamentally, if you look at this problem solution assemblage, there is a number of issues, the number of questions that are also go beyond technology. And these are the things that I'm also very interested in looking at in my work. And so there's many of them, but I've identified 3 specific questions that I think are also important to raise when we start looking at the role of technology. And so one is what is called the prior restraint of speech problem. And so this technically means that it is when you automatically filter content before it becomes public. It is, in legal terms, it's called the prior restraint on speech. And so that means that there are issues about pre-filtering and what that does to issues around the freedom of speech. And so a lot of kind of human rights frameworks to content moderation are saying that sometimes some of the mechanisms that are implemented go too far in prior restraint on speech. And again, the kind of debates are emerge around that. So the other thing that I'm very interested in is called what is called copycat policies. And so this debate on content moderation in terms of, if you look at, for instance, the NetDG law in Germany, it has been copied and parts of it have been copied. So the fact that you need to remove certain things and certain legal constraints have been copied in countries that possibly don't have as good protection of freedom of speech or protection of other things. So that kind of policies can, in a way, what is called mission creep. So they can be applied to other contexts where they are then used also to basically work around, deal with the opposition or speech that is not wanted by the government. And so there has been some reports around how this kind of wording is being also used. And the more fundamental thing, and I think, again, very interesting following up from the first discussion, is what I call the ground truth fallacy. And so the way you deal with machine learning and AI, for instance, identifying hate speech, is that you need to have a very specific agreement, code or agreement on what is the ground truth on which you base the models on. So increasingly, as there's a good quote by Lanzo, who says that such machine learning model tools can be evaluated on their accuracy, but accuracy in this sense typically refers to the rate at which the tool's evaluation of content matches humans' evaluation of the same content. However, it does not address whether the human evaluation of the content is correct. And in a way, the accuracy of a machine learning model does not reflect the assessment of ground truth. And so one of the interesting things in especially conflict situations, or let's take Ethiopia as an example, it is sometimes very difficult, or I would argue at times impossible, to come up with a ground truth on which based some of the models, because the ground truth itself is the outcome of certain kind of conflicts and antagonisms within society. So if you are trying to use this ground truth as a way of coming up with a ground or anchor on which the artificial intelligence models work, we are dealing with a selective choice. So sometimes that ground truth simply doesn't exist. So that's one thing that I'm also interested in investigating, that can we in certain situations even come up with a ground truth? Obviously, with the issues that there are a lot of problems that need to be addressed. So again, more questions, more kind of different perspectives that I have been bringing into my research. So what am I in fact then at the moment, what are we doing, and how I'm trying to kind of start approaching some of these kind of challenges. So the research, as I mentioned in the beginning, that we are doing for the University of Helsinki, it's called Media Platforms and Social Accountability, Dynamics, Practices and Discourses. And in a way, what we are examining is how these digital media platforms function as a crucial site for social accountability process and debates globally. And so what I'm interested in, the kind of how this informs local practices in the global south. And so what I've been observing, just coming back to the beginning of the presentation, what I've been observing, that there has been an interesting emergence of a debate since for the last 5 years. And so what I will do is I'll jump first to just looking at some of the questions, and then going into where Ethiopia, I think, comes up as one of the key case studies. So there has been an interesting kind of what I call a parallel discourse of extreme speech and content moderation. So we have the debates around Trump and the refugee crisis in Europe and Brexit, which has been kind of one debate that has been going on. But there has been also a parallel debate that I find very interesting, which has been going on with Myanmar conflict, kind of ethnic conflict, Sri Lanka, and then increasingly now Ethiopia being a case study of this. How should we deal with this more ideas of ethnic conflict and extreme speech around that? So what I'm interested in now looking at as a kind of three-part set of questions dealing with this research is that looking at the emergence of this discourse, this parallel discourse around AI content moderation in the kind of context in the global south. And then secondly, looking at the distinct practices or what actually happens, and especially during conflictual events. And so I'm using the upcoming elections in Ethiopia as a case study. And finally, if you look at the kind of framing that I started from the beginning, I'm very interested in the question of how is then technology being articulated as a solution to this, what is perceived to be a new problem in global digital communication. And so the term that is often being used by some of the more critical theories that they look at artificial intelligence as a form of anticipatory media. And by what that means is that it's a media that kind of is used to predict a certain kind of future outcome. So there's a good quote by Lagerquist who talks about, in a way, AI thus creates the future in predicting it. So I'm interested in seeing how some of the representatives, so people who work for social media companies, government, civil society, and other stakeholders, how they imagined that technology as a solution to the ongoing problem. So to see how that then, in a way, some of the practices that will impact some of the future ways that communication is going to be discussed and potentially regulated. So why Ethiopia, outside the fact that I've been actively involved in doing research in Ethiopia since 2014, is that what was interesting, if you look at this parallel discourse, that when we had a lot of debate around Trump and the US elections, there was a letter that I think most of the people never actually ended up seeing. So this was a letter by the Democrat Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who sent a letter to Mark Zuckerberg, and it was published on the page. And I think one or two of these articles only looked at it. And she was basically accusing Zuckerberg of personally being responsible for what is called catastrophic violence that has encompassed Ethiopia and the role Facebook is playing in that. And she made a strong case that something should be done about that. So Ethiopia is an interesting case study because it has now become one of the both a very contested area, and but it also has become a country where a lot of these things will be now kind of, especially around the elections, what's going to be going on. So again, you can see this multiple different debates and discourses being played out, but that's, so what I'm interested in looking at is both this debate around this problem solution, and then looking at how the practices of that happen in the more technological sense, and then focusing on also how a certain kind of anticipation of future is being played out in the role of artificial intelligence, especially in this debate. So I'll leave it at that, so we can, there's a lot to kind of unpack there, so we can then open up for questions, and I will try to hopefully kind of articulate or more explain better some of the many different themes that I brought into this. So, and I will, so you can, and also if you're interested, you can ask more questions at my email. Email is there, and my Twitter handle. So, but I'm sure we'll have a good discussion around some of these themes. Thanks.
Thank you, Matti, for this very interesting presentation. And you have provided an excellent starting presentation for our seminar series, because we hope to turn to a lot of the questions you posed in our upcoming meetings of this seminar series, particularly regarding how is Global South dealing with problems of hate speech and AI. So you were dealing with that a lot. So thank you very much, all of you. Now we're turning to our discussion, we already collected some questions regarding the presentation of Laura and Sunye. Maybe I can just step in to answer the very first question from Eugenia regarding whether we integrated migrants themselves into developing our coding scheme, which we didn't in this case. We did interview studies with refugees in another project we did in Berlin, where we interviewed refugees coming to Germany in 2015, 2016. But this wasn't really the basis of this coding, because we used this topic particularly as an example of really strong hate speech. And what would be interesting, what would have been better there would have been interviewing racists, for example, right-wing activists, and learning about their speech they're using when posting hate speech, which is a very difficult thing, because those people usually are not very open to being interviewed by scientists. So we had some experience with refugees and their perspectives, but we didn't include it in this no hate study. I don't know if Laura and Sunye may take over with the next question from the Q&A section regarding how to deal with the use of offensive language in a positive way by minorities, which may be also related to this problem of irony. Please, Sunye, Laura.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. I can start and then you can back me on, Laura, if you have ideas to add. Thank you very much for this question. The short answer is yes. I think, and I mean, this is something that Laura pointed to also in our presentation, that of course, this is a very this is a very good example for context specific sensibility, right? I mean, if in this context of reappropriation, of course, certain words are not at all meant offensive. However, if you are not sensitive for this context, you are not able to understand it. But yes, I mean, I guess especially from the US, there are already empirical studies showing this. We have one of these studies also mentioned on our slides, if you want to have a source on that.
Yeah, I think most research...
Do you want to step in, Laura?
Yeah, I can try. I think most of the research is on what we call the racial bias in language there, which means that African American English is judged more harshly. And that is, of course, because specific words are hurtful when used by white people, but not when used from within the community as an empowering way. And that goes for other communities as well than like for the LGBTQI community. What one could do, of course, from the technological perspective, is try to identify more information on who is speaking. Like if we have a bit of knowledge on the user who posts this comment, we might be able to infer whether they are using it positively or negatively. But I also want to caution about this, because inferring whether a white person or a Black person is speaking, or inferring whether there's a woman or a man speaking, comes with a whole bunch of other difficulties. So there might not necessarily be a technological solution to this.
I once read a paper which might be interesting in this context as well, and that was another technology another data based approach trying to fix this problem. In this study, the idea was to work with data from two different Reddit communities, which one, I think it were actually 6. Anyhow, they used, for example, a racist subred and compared language use on this subreddit to an activist empowerment subreddit, and then try to train the machine to understand the difference. So I found this very interesting in this regard. Just a little idea.
Okay, thank you. There are some more questions regarding your project, but I think we might include Matti in our discussion as well. And I'm not sure if this question from India may be something you could comment on. The question of how powerful can AI be, even if we see that large companies like Microsoft are failing with their chatbots, for example. So what's the outlook there?
So I think there's a book by Tartan Gillespie on content moderation who said it really well, that it is content moderation is premised on a paradox, that in a way it is impossible, but it has to be done. So what I find, rather than looking specifically at this, is a certain model going to be the best way for identifying every instance of hate speech, is that rather what does this content moderation represent around certain new emerging political trends in society? So obviously artificial intelligence can get better and but at the same time, there are certain limitations to how much can be solved by technology. And also at the same time, what is not being discussed when we focus on technology. So what is being so-called disarticulated from the over-focus on accuracy and improving an artificial intelligence. So in fact, that there might be other ways of addressing that problem as well. So again, of course, technology will get better, and it'll increasingly be more sophisticated in identifying certain types. And now, in terms of there's a lot of kind of advancements being made. At the same time, it also comes at a cost, and it comes at a kind of way of looking at the problem in a way that doesn't allow us room to look at other problems. So I would say I would answer that difficult question in a more roundabout way, I guess.
Thank you. Maybe that connects a little bit to one or two questions who are meeting at some point. The question, the last question, or one question from the Q&A, whether there are non-technological solutions who could deal with hate speech detection and moderation. In the chat, there was a similar question: what role manual coding could play in this context? Maybe both teams might have an answer to that. I don't know if Sunye may tell something about how the company used our algorithm in their work, because that was a more comprehensive approach, and maybe Matti can say something about that as well. Sunye, are you going to start?
Yes, thanks. Thank you for that question. Yeah, I can tell you a little bit about a pre-study we did also in the No Hate project, which was qualitative interviews with community managers and content moderators working in German newsrooms. And we asked them about a lot of things, but also what from their experience really helps, because their impression was that hate speech is a problem, and they all reported that they feel quite under pressure because of an increasing amount of rude comments, harsh comments, and also an increase in the tone, so to say. And what they told us is that, yeah, a visible human moderator is the best solution. So they said that often it really helped if very, very early in a discussion that is at risk to escalate, someone, from the moderating team is like voicing or responding to a comment. And so that was, of course, that is a challenge because they can't always, the human resources are always limited. But yeah, we heard several examples from those interview partners that the human in the loop, so to say, making a huge difference.
Maybe I'll jump on. Maybe I'll jump into that question as well. So when we did the work on content moderation, not content moderation, on content analysis during the Mechachal project in Ethiopia, we spent probably 6 months trying to get the coders to agree on key definitions. And so this in a way links the second question that I was seeing in the Q&A about the current events taking place in Tigray in Ethiopia. So the reason why I'm very interested in this idea of ground truth as the anchor on which a lot of these things are being now kind of perceived. So basically machine learning requires ground truth to work effectively. And so I'm interested in the problematization of the idea of ground truth, because oftentimes there are circumstances where even within coders, you will not achieve ground truth. So if we use a very binary classification model, can we then, and I think the question on Tigray is very interesting, is that can we then reimagine the use of artificial intelligence in a way that there is no agreed ground truth, that we are instead looking at contested political debates that a lot of people will have different opinions. And so obviously in the context of a very, very limited understanding of hate speech, yes, it's very easy to see, okay, these words are being used. But once you go into the more broader context around conflict and especially very, very ongoing ethnic conflict, sometimes these terms are more representative of the conflict itself. And so rather than looking at as a way of coming up with the ground truth, you try to investigate what are these antagonisms and contradictions and conflicts that are being played out. So I would say there will be a lot of interesting ways, and that's where I think artificial intelligence could potentially come in to identify where people disagree on things, rather than coming up with an agreed definition that becomes the standard on which to base on things. But now a lot of the debates, as I see it on especially hate speech, we are dealing with only one kind of ground truth, and then this is being implemented, rather than saying that maybe there might be 10 different ground truths on it. And we have to be able to negotiate these different framings and articulations. So again, it's just in a way how this problem, and I see it as the way this problem and solution is being framed.
Matti, can I just follow up on that question with you? Because I thought one of the interesting things that you highlighted, and one of the things that we also want to probe during this series, is that companies like Facebook are much less interested in what's happening in Ethiopia or in the Somali context, because it's not so much in their business interests. So my question is who's filling these gaps then? What companies are governments turning to when it comes to AI and content moderation, or are they developing their own ways of addressing this? And what are the implications of these other private actors or government actors that are also very much getting involved in this space in Africa?
Well, again, I have certain discussions that I'm not at liberty to probably talk about here. But if you look at it more broadly, there's a whole industry that currently exists around what is called kind of they call the surveillance industry. If you look at work on Privacy International, so there is a whole industry that exists around identifying certain types of content and then using artificial intelligence. So obviously, if you look at it in more broader trends in the African context, a lot of Chinese companies are coming in, and they do have their own mechanisms and tools for doing that. So of course, there are other companies. And so if you start looking at the kind of ecology of certain companies that provide so-called content moderation services, and I think the special issue that you edited, I think was very, in a way, eye-opening in that sense that content moderation only became one part of a panoply of different practices that can be taken. And we talk about content moderation in the European context, it's usually about hate speech, but content moderation can also be shut the internet down. So what happened there was a very good cartoon by Gado around the Ugandan elections, where they banned Trump from Facebook, but in Uganda, the President trumped social media from the country. So it was a kind of a ironic play on the whole thing. And so obviously somebody will take there are companies that offer these kind of services. So again, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's a different question. So what I'm kind of interested in, that at least there needs to be some debate around discussion around this debate. So it's not only that can we come up with a better system, but what is it in fact going around? What are the political and the future stakes around developing these systems? And of course, as we know, when we work in different contexts, sometimes these developments are not all positive. So, yeah.
Sunye?
Yeah, I just wanted to add one point to this whole discussion on the role of humans in the process. And I think one point that is often overlooked is that a lot of human content moderators working for the big companies are employed by outsourced contractors, and they work in very difficult working conditions. And I think, yeah, that's also something I just wanted to add, that we should not forget about this aspect when we talk about human content, or the role of humans in content moderation itself, but also in creating training data for then the role of humans to label training data that is then used to train the model. Just one point that I wanted to add, because I think it's really important.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left. Maybe we turn to one aspect we haven't mentioned yet, that is more the more general aspect. There's some questions from Jens, as I see, and his question is it would a general approach that is not looking at identifying hate speech a better approach? Or would a better approach be to identify the actors, the accounts, the networks who are posting hate speech, and then maybe using a more, I would say, criminological approach, not focusing on the speech itself, but on the persons and actors who are posting that, and trying to deal with them? I don't know if Matti has an idea about that.
Well, there's an interesting two different debates. That some of the debates that, because I've been involved in the more hate speech field, and then also the field on violent political extremism, and the line between the two are often very blurred. And so violent political extremism tends to be more individual based, whereas hate speech tends to be slightly more content based. So again, obviously certain types of speech should be banned, and there's a certain criminological aspect to it, and there are certain ways of identifying it. But yeah, I mean, then the question is, how much surveillance do we want to have, that we identify these people that we ban online based on online speech? And so it's a more broader social, I guess, a broader question that needs to be raised in society, because the obvious, the same tools of surveillance, which we are talking about here, can also be then used for more nefarious purposes on the context. So, but yeah, I mean, obviously some sort of criminal aspect has to be taken to if there's that kind of speech that has consequences. Yeah, that's my personal viewpoint.
I don't know if anybody wants to add. If not, there is also this political aspect that is mentioned in one question, whether approaches like this Facebook's oversight board might play a role here, or how would you evaluate that? Maybe that's an open question to the whole panel. Is that helpful in dealing with hate speech online?
So maybe again, I don't want to dominate the kind of discussion, but there is the Facebook oversight board is relatively interesting. So they've had a few cases recently, and But there's also another proposal that was made by Article 19 called social media councils, which was based on more participatory approaches to social media content moderation based on the human rights freedom of speech framework. So again, we are focusing on the Facebook oversight board, but whether that's the best way, obviously it is in the company's interest to do it that way. But there are also alternative civil society mechanisms that have been proposed for the same purpose. So I think we should look at these two in parallel and look at the kind of different solutions that have been proposed.
If I can just add one thing, because I think the Facebook Oversight Board is a really interesting question for the seminar series. And I think poses that they're not opening their algorithms to the investigation of the oversight board. I mean, there's some argument that this might happen at some point, but it's really unclear what kind of process that would look like. So if it's just evaluating some of the human monitoring, I think it poses really big questions about how much is it really getting at the real way that Facebook is addressing hate speech online. I think I saw another question about the takedown of content, and I think another interesting aspect of this oversight board is I think almost all of the decisions that they've overturned have been when they thought that Facebook was too ambitious about taking down content. And I think that also reflects some of the leanings of the oversight board, but it also poses really interesting questions when you're looking at the global south and you're taking the case of Ethiopia or Somalia, as we mentioned before. And the real question is all of the content that's missed, all of the content that's left up, that's and that hasn't gone before the oversight board to the same extent that it's been the takedown of content.
Okay. So any other questions left? We just see some links posted. Be sure that you don't miss them. We had some requests for contact, and I would just rely on you're able to exchange your emails. All of the presenters shared their email connections, so I would invite you to directly approach them. Yeah, here I see some links. Okay, yeah. So regarding the Q&A questions you've posted here, I tried to cover them all. I just tried to bind some of them together into one question. If you have the feeling that I haven't asked your questions, give me a hint, but we try to keep an eye on that to cover everything that came up. Let's just check whether there have been some links.
You need to share the link to because you shared it to the panelists. If you want to share it again to everyone.
Yeah, so I just check whether there were some links posted in the chat. They were just posted to certain participants and not to all participants. That may be the point. Yeah. So then, if you want to have something that is perceived by everybody, just post it again here, but I think it worked now. Great. So yeah, I would say if there's nothing pressing, then we have come to an end right on time. It's 4:30 German time now, so it worked all out quite fine, and we're just at the beginning. So we're looking forward to quite interesting series of even more seminars. You may have seen the whole program. We will send out invitations again for the next meeting. I don't know if Nicole has the date of our next meeting. I would I don't. I would just have to check for it.
Tuesday, April 27th. So join us in a month again.
Great, yeah. So then we are going more deep into technical questions, and also then we're approaching the field that we are mostly interested in, and that is to see application and problems in various fields of the global South, in East Africa and West Africa. So that might be most interesting until June. Okay, so thank you very much for being with us. It all worked quite fine. I'm happy that we didn't encounter major technical problems. And I'm very much looking forward to meeting you all again in April and have some more interesting presentations and discussions. Bye from my side.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Nicole. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you so much.